If they smile, run. Commander Vaiken Dhoris uttered those words as the enemy envoy stepped into the chamber. His voice was steady, but his gut coiled like a starship caught in a gravity well. He had seen this before, the way humans wielded diplomacy like a monofilament blade, gliding through negotiations with an ease that left their opponents bleeding before they realized they'd been cut. Yet his superiors, in their arrogance, had dismissed every warning. "Commander, you overestimate them," High Strategist Tharik had scoffed just hours earlier, lounging in his command seat aboard the war cruiser Vehemence. "They are a species of traitors and bureaucrats, desperate to avoid war. You expect a species that brews plants in boiling water to be a strategic threat? Yes." And now, as the double doors hissed open, bathing the chamber in stark white light, Vaiken braced for a different kind of battle. Ambassador Desmond Hale stepped inside with the measured gait of a man who had already won. His dark suit, crisp and unblemished, carried none of the embellishments favored by the Cathari nobility. No rank insignias, no ceremonial sashes. His only adornment was a simple wrist chrono, ticking away in the eerie silence. His hands were empty, his expression calm, but Vaiken knew better. This was not the face of a man pleading for peace. This was the face of a strategist who had already calculated every possible outcome. "Ah," Hale exhaled, his voice carrying the warm undertones of casual familiarity, as if they were old friends reuniting rather than enemies meeting on the precipice of war. "Commander Dhoris, I must say, your fleet's positioning outside this station is ambitious." A slow blink was Vaiken's only response. He had stationed the fleet in an unassailable formation, staggered layers of warships prepared to crush any resistance. How had Hale interpreted it as anything else? The human diplomat stepped forward, hands clasped behind his back, his footsteps measured against the polished alloy floor. The sound was maddeningly unhurried, like a metronome marking the countdown to something inevitable. "We have terms," Vaiken stated, skipping formalities. He wasn't here for verbal sparring. "You will vacate the contested sectors immediately. Failure to comply will result in forcible removal." Hale's lips curved, just slightly. Not enough to be called a smirk, but not the neutral expression of someone merely receiving information. "Ah," he mused. "Forcible removal. That does sound serious." Vaiken felt his blood run cold. That wasn't a diplomat's response. That was the voice of a man who had already decided how this conversation would end. Beside him, Lieutenant Adren shifted, his hand brushing the sidearm holstered at his waist. A useless reflex. No war would be won in this room, and Vaiken had no doubt that if things came to violence, they wouldn't be the ones walking out. Hale turned almost absently toward the heads-up display on the wall. The Cathari Dominion's territorial map flickered in an unsettling shade of crimson, marking contested regions in bold strokes. "Yes, I see your position," Hale murmured, rubbing his chin in apparent contemplation. "But I wonder—" His fingers danced over his wrist chrono. A soft chime echoed through the chamber. Then, one by one, the glowing red sectors on the map vanished. Vaiken's breath hitched. He stepped forward instinctively, jaw tightening as he stared at the screen. "What is this?" Hale offered a maddeningly polite shrug. "Updates." "Explain." Another soft chime. Another red sector vanished. "We have already initiated de-escalation efforts in those territories," Hale continued, his voice smooth as polished steel. "Your supply chains, Commander, your fuel reserves, your munitions factories. We negotiated alternative arrangements with them some time ago. I believe you'll find that, as of approximately 4 minutes ago, those systems are no longer under Dominion control." Vaiken's pulse thundered. He turned sharply toward Adren. "Confirm that." The lieutenant scrambled to the nearest interface, fingers flying over the controls. A beat of silence. Then two. Then, "Sir," Adren rasped, voice hollow. "He's correct. We lost control of the supply chains." Vaiken felt the floor beneath him might as well have been a collapsing airlock. This wasn't a negotiation. This was a siege. and Hale had been orchestrating it long before the Cathari had even realized they were at war. The human clasped his hands once more, regarding Vaiken with a look of gentle patience. "As I was saying, Commander, we have terms of our own." A second chime. A new set of systems on the display turned blue. Human-controlled. This wasn't a military strike. It was a surgical removal of their empire, system by system, without firing a single shot. Vaiken clenched his fists, heat surging behind his eyes. "You expect us to surrender?" Hale tilted his head slightly, as though contemplating the weight of the word. "Oh no," he said lightly. "Not at all. I expect you to agree." The final chime sounded. The last contested sector turned blue. Outside the station, 1,000 Dominion warships sat fully armed, yet utterly useless. Every fuel node rerouted, every supply line severed, every strategic point neutralized before they had even realized the battle had begun. Vaiken exhaled slowly, the bitter taste of realization settling on his tongue. This was what made humans dangerous, not their weapons, not their armies, not their technology. It was their unshakable patience, their ability to lay the foundation of a war years in advance, their infuriating, unwavering, utterly impenetrable politeness, delivered like a scalpel through the gut. Hale folded his arms, and that subtle, quiet smile remained. "Shall we discuss the transition, Commander?" Vaiken's fingers curled at his sides. He had spent his entire life preparing for war, training, commanding, leading. But how did one fight an enemy that never gave them a battlefield? He exhaled sharply through his nose. "I need time." Hale nodded graciously. "Of course, take all the time you need." The polite phrasing grated like a serrated blade. They both knew the war was already over, and it had ended with a smile. The room still carried the weight of its last conversation. A silence not of peace, but of staggering defeat. It was the silence of a soldier realizing the battlefield was never his to fight on. Vaiken stood in the same chamber, but he no longer occupied the same reality. He had stepped into this meeting as a commander. He was leaving it as something else, a man who had been played. The laser plasma display still glowed with the damning truth. His empire, consumed without a single casualty, no orbital bombardments, no desperate fleet skirmishes, no scorched planets. Just a series of smiling conversations that had bled a civilization dry before they could even draw a blade. Desmond Hale had already left. His presence no longer needed. His words had done the work. Vaiken's fingers twitched at his sides, his breath slow and measured, as if any sudden movement might shatter what little ground he had left beneath him. The room smelled of something sterile, untouched, a manufactured cleanliness that felt like an insult. Lieutenant Audrin still stood near the heads-up display, shoulders rigid, knuckles pressing against the console as if he could will the information to change. The young officer had spoken only once in the past 10 minutes, and that was to confirm what they both already knew. "We're compromised," Audrin finally muttered, his voice distant, as if he were speaking from another world. "Every shipyard, every fueling depot, every—" "I know." Vaiken cut him off. There was no point in saying it again. Audrin exhaled sharply, his fists clenching. "How? How in the void did they do it? How do you negotiate an entire empire into submission?" Vaiken turned away from the display, eyes unfocused. His mind was a battlefield, replaying every interaction, every step that had led them here. And then, like a blade sliding into place, he understood. "This war didn't start today," he murmured. "It didn't even start this cycle." Audrin's head snapped toward him, confusion flickering behind his eyes. "What are you saying?" Vaiken's voice was measured, but there was something beneath it, something brittle, dangerous. "I'm saying that by the time we even realized there was a war," he said slowly, "we had already lost." Audrin's jaw tightened, his breathing shallower now. He was trying to process, trying to grasp the enormity of it. But wars were supposed to be fought with weapons, not words, not meetings, not smiles. Vaiken walked toward the console, fingers tapping against the interface, pulling up data Hale had left behind. A gift, wrapped in diplomacy, bound in chains. The heads-up display shifted, displaying intercepted transmissions from human trade hubs over the last 10 years. Nothing suspicious, nothing overt, just shipment agreements, long-term supply contracts, economic partnerships, and yet, as Vaiken scrolled through them, his stomach twisted into knots. The humans had not just infiltrated their infrastructure, they had designed it. He scrolled faster. Contracts, corporate acquisitions, quiet investments, all small enough to go unnoticed, but coordinated enough to form a web. "Stop!" Audrin breathed, stepping forward, eyes darting across the data. No, that's impossible. These deals, they're decades old." Vaiken didn't look at him. He was still reading, still descending into the abyss of a war that had never looked like war. "This is how they fight," he murmured. "This is why they never lose. They don't win battles. They win before battles even exist." Odrin's breathing turned ragged, his fingers dragging through his hair. "And we let them." Vaiken clenched his jaw. No, he had let them. Because he had spent his life preparing for war as he understood it. Battles in open space, tactical maneuvers, weaponized fleets that tore through systems like wildfire. But humans understood war differently. War was not the act of destruction. War was control. And Desmond Hale had smiled while handing him the realization far too late. Vaiken's hands curled into fists. "They never intended to negotiate," he said, low and bitter. "This meeting, it was just a formality. The war was already over when we stepped in here. Hale was only here to watch us realize it." Audrin's face twisted, an expression of barely contained frustration. "So what do we do?" Vaiken looked at him then. Looked at the question hanging between them. The answer, unspoken but undeniable. There is nothing to do. Because wars were fought with strategies, and strategies needed a foundation to stand on. And the Cathari Dominion no longer had one. A soft chime echoed through the room. One last insult. One final reminder of how easily everything had been taken. A transmission from the vehemence. Vaiken straightened, forcing his spine into something that still resembled command. "Patch it through." The display flickered. High Strategist Tharic's face appeared, his normally imperious features set in something Vaiken had never seen before. Not anger, not determination, fear. "Commander," Tharic's voice carried an edge, but it was fraying. "We have a problem." Vaiken already knew what he was going to say, but the words still landed like a blade to the ribs. "The human envoy is gone," Tharic continued, voice clipped. "And so is every single high-ranking member of our trade commission. They boarded a transport ship together. Destination unknown." A weight settled in Vaiken's chest. A diplomatic defection. The Dominion's own officials, leaving of their own volition. No assassinations. No coups, just quiet, polite persuasion. Vaiken inhaled sharply. "And the fleet?" Another pause. Too long. Too telling. "The fleets are—" Tharic hesitated, as if reluctant to say it aloud. "We are experiencing complications." The way he said it made the blood in Vaiken's veins turn to ice. He turned to Audrin, who was already running calculations on the console. The lieutenant's face drained of color as the results loaded. Vaiken barely had to read them. He already knew. The warships were useless. Fuel distribution, rerouted, weapons systems, remote locked, fleet coordination, jammed. Not through brute force, not through sabotage, through contracts, through infrastructure, through laws that had been signed and agreed upon decades ago. Vaiken exhaled slowly. Hale had never come here to threaten them. He had come here to watch the realization settle in. "Commander," Tharic's voice was strained now, uncharacteristically uncertain. What is our next move?" Vaiken looked at the display. Looked at the Cathari fleet, suspended in a cage of their own making. And for the first time in his life, he had no answer. A diplomatic war. A battle with no armies, no weapons, no explosions. And they had already lost. He pressed his hands against the console, head bowing forward slightly, not in submission, in something far colder, understanding. "We plan," he murmured. "We plan like they do." Audrin turned to him sharply. "And what does that mean?" Vaiken exhaled slowly, straightening. "It means," he said, his voice quieter now but sharp as a blade, "that the next war begins today." The Dominion was dying, and no one wanted to admit it. Vaiken stood at the viewport of the vehemence, hands clasped behind his back, watching his fleet drift like phantoms in the void. They still looked formidable, rows upon rows of warships gleaming under the light of a distant star. But looks were an illusion, and illusions didn't win wars. The Dominion wasn't in control anymore. Not really. He could feel it unraveling, in the way subordinates spoke in clipped, uncertain tones, in the way officers exchanged uneasy glances over encrypted messages, in the way the silence carried a weight it never had before. The war had already ended, but no one had told them. He turned as Lieutenant Audrin entered the chamber, his uniform slightly disheveled, his movements sharper than usual, agitation barely restrained. "You're going to want to see this." Vaiken followed him down the corridor, past officers pretending not to eavesdrop. The air was heavier here, carrying a tension that crept under the skin like an old wound reopening. Inside the command center, a laser plasma display flickered to life, not battle formations, not fleet movements, not even diplomatic transmissions, riots, cities burning under artificial skies, Cathari citizens clashing with Dominion security forces, protests outside military installations. And above it all, human supply freighters, floating undisturbed through the chaos. Vaiken exhaled slowly. "It's begun." Audrin's fingers curled at his sides. They knew this would happen. They planned for it. Of course they had. Take away a civilization's ability to fight, and they will search for something else to destroy. Vaiken turned his gaze back to the screen, analyzing the reports that flooded in. The rebellion had no face, no single leader. It had erupted in multiple sectors, almost simultaneously, too coordinated to be coincidence. Audrin frowned. "Do you think they're funding this?" "Funding?" Vaiken let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "They don't need to fund it. They just created the conditions for it to exist. No trade, no resources, no war. The Dominion had been backed into a corner where its own people were now its greatest enemy. And the humans? They watched. They waited. They smiled. A sharp chime interrupted his thoughts. Another transmission. Another wound about to be carved open. He turned to the nearest officer. "Put it through." The screen flickered, revealing High Strategist Tharik. But the man Vaiken saw wasn't the one he had served under for decades. Tharik looked smaller, not physically. No, his posture was still rigid, his expression locked into something firm. But it was in the eyes. There was a hesitation there, a crack in the foundation. "Commander." Tharik's voice was measured, but there was an edge beneath it. "I need an assessment of the situation." Vaiken knew what the question really meant. What he thought Tharik wanted to hear. "It's under control." "The truth?" "It's spreading," Vaiken said, his voice quiet but unyielding. "And if we don't act, we'll be fighting our own people before the next cycle turns." Tharik's jaw tightened. "Then we put them down." A slow beat passed before Vaiken spoke again. "That's exactly what they want." The strategist's gaze hardened. "Explain." Vaiken took a step forward, the weight of his words settling like iron in the air. "They don't need to fight us," he said, "because they know we'll fight ourselves." Tharik's silence stretched long enough to fracture into something dangerous. "This is still our Dominion," Tharik said finally, voice like a blade pressed against the skin, "and we will maintain order. I expect you to ensure that." The transmission ended, leaving behind an echo of something that felt like a death sentence. Audrin exhaled sharply. "They'll deploy suppression teams." Vaiken didn't respond. He was already moving, already calculating, already seeing the path unfolding before them. Tharik was a strategist, but not like Hale. He thought in battles, not in wars. He saw a rebellion. Vaiken saw a noose tightening. Because this was how it happened. This was how the Dominion crumbled. Not with the arrival of an enemy fleet, not with a decisive battle in open space, but with a whisper in the right ears, A subtle shift in loyalty, a fracture in the foundation that everyone ignored until it was too late. And now, it was too late. Another officer rushed forward. "Sir, new reports coming in. It's not just civilian unrest." A hesitation. "It's the fleet." Vaiken's head turned sharply. "Explain." The officer swallowed, bringing up another set of displays. Key ship captains, tactical command officers, entire battalions, gone, not dead, missing, vanished without a trace. Audrin whispered, "Desertion?" Vaiken's voice was like stone. "No." A single word, but it carried the weight of a graveyard, because desertion was an act of desperation. This was calculated. This was something worse. He stared at the names on the list, trying to ignore the sinking weight in his stomach. He recognized too many of them. Good men, loyal men, the kind of soldiers who didn't just walk away. Not unless... His throat felt dry. Not unless they had been convinced. A slow dread crept through his chest, cold and suffocating. Hale hadn't just neutralized the Dominion's infrastructure, he had dismantled its people. This wasn't a war. It was a controlled demolition. And Vaiken was standing inside a collapsing building, still trying to figure out where the first crack had started. His voice was quiet when he spoke. "We need to leave." Audrin frowned. "Leave?" Vaiken turned, meeting his lieutenant's confused stare with something dark and certain. "They didn't just take our systems," he murmured. "They took our officers, our command structure." He gestured at the names still glowing on the display. "And if they could take them, what makes you think we aren't next?" Audrin's pulse visibly quickened. And then, as if the universe wanted to make the decision for them, the emergency klaxons screamed to life. The display flickered again, new alerts flooding the system. Unauthorized personnel boarding the vehements. And beneath it, one last message, a direct transmission, no sender ID, no encryption, just a single, polite, unassuming text. "Shall we discuss your next steps, Commander?" Vaiken inhaled. His fingers curled into fists, and for the first time, he truly understood what it meant to be hunted. The klaxons screamed, sharp and unrelenting, pulsing through the vehements like a heartbeat gone wrong. Vaiken Dhoris moved before he thought. His body operated on muscle memory, turn, stride, check corners, assess threats, while his mind dragged behind, still reeling from that message. "Shall we discuss your next steps, Commander?" They were on his ship. He pushed through the command corridor, Audrin at his side, tension bristling off them both like static before a lightning strike. "Where?" Vaiken snapped as they stormed into the control deck. "Mid-deck airlocks breached," an officer's voice cracked over the din of alarms. "No signs of forced entry. Authorization codes were used." Which meant someone had let them in. Vaiken's gut twisted. He flicked his gaze to the laser plasma display, scanning the ship's interior schematics. Indicators blinked red. Sections of the vessel, sealed, locked down, quarantined. A trap. "Status on external fleet response?" Audrin demanded, voice tight. A different officer answered, sweat glistening along his brow. "No movement. The Dominion ships are—" He hesitated. "Idle, sir. No one's answering hails." Vaiken's fingers curled against the console. Number not idle. Compromised. The Dominion's navy, one of the largest in the sector, wasn't moving. Because the war was over, and the last soldiers to realize it were still standing on this ship. A proximity alert flared on the display. New arrivals, not warships, diplomatic transports. Vaiken stared at the blinking dots, bile rising in his throat. They weren't here to fight. They were here to finalize the acquisition. A voice crackled over ship-wide comms. Even distorted by audio compression, it still carried the same unshakable composure. "Commander Dhoris," Desmond Hale greeted, pleasant as ever. "I apologize for the intrusion. I understand this is a difficult time for your people." Vaiken turned sharply toward the officers in the room. "Shut down comm access, now." Audrin moved to comply, but the moment his fingers brushed the console, the ship-wide displays flickered. Hale's voice did not need permission. The ship had already been taken. That won't be necessary, Hale continued. I'm only here to offer clarity. I imagine things must seem overwhelming. Vaiken's jaw locked. Clarity? His voice came out low, the restrained crackle of a fire just before it engulfed a structure whole. You want to explain how you dismantled an empire over tea and paperwork? There was a soft chuckle on the other end of the transmission. Not dismantled, Hale corrected. Reorganized. Considerate. An optimization of resources. You built something impressive, Commander. But the Dominion wasn't sustainable. You know that. I suspect you've always known that. Vaiken's pulse hammered against his skull. Hale wasn't gloating. He wasn't sneering or mocking or bartering. He was calm, measured. As if this wasn't the end of a war, but a foregone conclusion. Like a man explaining gravity. He turned to Audrin. Status on manual override? The lieutenant's expression was grim. Nothing. Systems are responding, but Vehemence's core permissions have been rewritten. I don't even know when it happened. Which meant it had been in place before the rebellion, before the fleet immobilization, before this war had even begun. Hale's voice broke the silence again. You've always been a man of action, Commander. It's why I find your restraint commendable. Vaiken's vision darkened at the edges. His fingers curled against the control panel. Is that what this is? He said, voice dangerously even. A character assessment? Hale sighed, almost regretful. I would prefer not to see unnecessary bloodshed, he said. And I suspect neither would you. The subtle weight of those words settled over the room like a predator's shadow. Vaiken exhaled slowly, forcing himself to think beyond the rage curling inside his ribs. Hale was offering a way out, which meant not all pieces had fallen into place yet. If the Dominion was already completely absorbed, there would be no need for a conversation, which meant Vaiken still had something they wanted. He turned to Audrin, keeping his voice low. We have one move left. The lieutenant's gaze sharpened. Say the word. Vaiken's mind calculated probabilities at a breakneck pace. They couldn't take back the ship. They had no control over the Dominion fleet. Every external ship was silent, or already turned. But the one thing humans valued most wasn't territory, or resources, or even dominance. It was stability. Which meant, if we can't win, Vaiken muttered, we become too costly to lose. Audrin frowned. Then understanding flickered across his expression. He tapped into the classified Dominion data vaults, the one part of Vehemence's systems not yet overwritten. Encryption key? Audrin asked. Vaiken entered it manually, the interface unlocked. Files blinked into view. Everything the Dominion had ever acquired on human movements, trade routes, security protocols, war simulations, every alternative strategy humans had designed in case diplomacy failed. Because for all their planning, humans weren't infallible. They always had contingencies. Vaiken's lips pulled into something that wasn't a smile, wasn't a snarl, a razor-thin expression between fury and revelation. If the Dominion was already dead, then he would make sure its corpse had teeth. Audrin's fingers flew over the console, preparing the data for mass distribution. Sir, an officer called urgently. Hale's ships are docking. Vaiken nodded once, his pulse a steady drumbeat against his skull. They couldn't fight this war the way they had always fought wars. But if humans wanted control, they would have to pay for it in secrets. He activated the final command. Data pulses rippled outward. A silent detonation of intelligence scattering across Dominion space, not just to the military, to the populace, to every system that still thought the war wasn't over. Let them see. Let them decide what comes next. Audrin exhaled sharply, straightening. Transmission is away. Vaiken turned back to the display. Hale was waiting, calm, measured, still smiling. The docking bays unlocked, and the doors slid open. Vaiken squared his shoulders, stepping forward as the enemy entered without a weapon in sight. It was the end of a war, or the beginning of something worse. The air inside Vehemence was thick with the weight of decisions already made. Vaiken Dhoris had no illusions about what was happening. This wasn't a surrender. This was an execution. His transmission had already spread through the Dominion like a controlled fire, revealing the depths of human preparation, their silent infiltration, the slow, calculated dismantling of an empire that once thought itself untouchable. If there was any hope left, it was fragile, flickering on the edge of a storm that was already overhead. But it wasn't over yet. Vaiken strode forward as the docking bay doors yawned open. A controlled gust of air swept past him as the human delegation stepped onto the Cathari warship. Desmond Hale walked as though he were arriving for a luncheon, not the absorption of a civilization. His movements remained effortless, a man untouched by urgency, dressed in the same unassuming dark attire that felt more like armor than fabric. Behind him his aides moved with trained restraint, no weapons drawn, no guards flanking them. They had no need for protection in a battle they had already won, and yet they had come in person. That meant something. Vaiken didn't greet them. He let the silence stretch. He let the pressure build, let it coil around the chamber like a tightening snare. Hale finally broke it with a voice as smooth as polished stone. "Commander Dhoris," he said, "I trust you understand why we're here." Vaiken inclined his head slightly. "I understand more than you'd like me to." The corner of Hale's mouth lifted, not a smirk, something quieter. "Then I imagine this conversation will be brief." Odrin stood just behind Vaiken, his presence felt rather than seen, hands resting stiffly behind his back. Hale's eyes flicked toward him, lingering for half a second longer than necessary. Vaiken caught it. The humans had studied them too well. They knew hierarchy, knew where the real decisions were made, and in a war of dismantling, the goal was not to kill, but to replace. Hale moved past pleasantries, hands clasped behind his back as he paced toward the heads-up display in the center of the chamber. It flickered to life at his approach, human encrypted data pulsing across its surface like a heartbeat. "Your transmission was ambitious," Hale mused, tilting his head slightly. "An attempt to ignite rebellion within a rebellion. Clever, but ultimately—" His fingers tapped against his chrono. On the display, half the Dominion fleet went dark. The moment sank deep into Vaiken's chest. Hale hadn't even needed to issue a command. He merely pressed a button and entire battalions disappeared from the war map. "No need for concern," Hale assured. "They're still alive. But I imagine you understand, Commander. There is no fleet left to fight for you." Vaiken said nothing. There was nothing to say. Odrin took a sharp breath, his voice a low murmur of controlled fury. "You took our officers. You bought our systems. But you don't own our people." Hale exhaled through his nose, a quiet, almost amused sound. "You assume we need ownership," he said. "We only needed to create an alternative more appealing than the one you offered." The words settled like a knife slipping beneath armor. Because he was right. The Dominion had ruled with power, with intimidation, with the belief that fear could keep a civilization intact. The humans had offered stability, order, certainty, and people had followed certainty. Desmond Hale walked as though he were arriving for a luncheon, not the absorption of a civilization. His movements remained effortless, a man untouched by urgency, dressed in the same unassuming dark attire that felt more like armor than fabric. Behind him his aides moved with trained restraint, no weapons drawn, no guards flanking them. They had no need for protection in a battle they had already won, and yet they had come in person. That meant something. Vaiken didn't greet them. He let the silence stretch. He let the pressure build, let it coil around the chamber like a tightening snare. Hale finally broke it with a voice as smooth as polished stone. "Commander Dhoris," he said, "I trust you understand why we're here." Vaiken inclined his head slightly. "I understand more than you'd like me to." The corner of Hale's mouth lifted, not a smirk, something quieter. "Then I imagine this conversation will be brief." Odrin stood just behind Vaiken, his presence felt rather than seen, hands resting stiffly behind his back. Hale's eyes flicked toward him, lingering for half a second longer than necessary. Vaiken caught it. The humans had studied them too well. They knew hierarchy, knew where the real decisions were made, and in a war of dismantling, the goal was not to kill, but to replace. Hale moved past pleasantries, hands clasped behind his back as he paced toward the heads-up display in the center of the chamber. It flickered to life at his approach, human encrypted data pulsing across its surface like a heartbeat. Your transmission was ambitious, Hale mused, tilting his head slightly. An attempt to ignite rebellion within a rebellion. Clever, but ultimately, his fingers tapped against his chrono. On the display, half the Dominion fleet went dark. The moment sank deep into Vaiken's chest. Hale hadn't even needed to issue a command. He merely pressed a button and entire battalions disappeared from the war map. No need for concern, Hale assured. They're still alive. But I imagine you understand, Commander. There is no fleet left to fight for you. Vaiken said nothing. There was nothing to say. Audrin took a sharp breath, his voice a low murmur of controlled fury. You took our officers. You bought our systems. But you don't own our people. Hale exhaled through his nose, a quiet, almost amused sound. You assume we need ownership, he said. We only needed to create an alternative more appealing than the one you offered. The words settled like a knife slipping beneath armor. Because he was right. The Dominion had ruled with power, with intimidation, with the belief that fear could keep a civilization intact. The humans had offered stability, order, certainty, and people had followed certainty. Vaiken had watched it unfold, had seen entire colonies surrender not because they were forced, but because they had already been living under human control without realizing it. A quiet rebellion had never needed soldiers. It had needed patience. Hale finally turned back to face him fully. We are not without compassion, Commander. Vaiken nearly laughed. The sheer audacity of it. You neutralized a galactic empire over the course of a decade, he said, voice like steel. And you call that compassion? Hale didn't blink. Would you have preferred war? The silence that followed was different this time. Not tension, not a struggle for dominance. It was an answer, because no, Vaiken wouldn't have. He had lived through enough wars to know the cost. Hale tilted his head slightly, as if acknowledging the weight of the moment. Your people will survive. They will integrate. In time, this will be seen not as a collapse, but an evolution. Audrin's fists clenched. You sound like you expect gratitude. Hale's gaze remained steady. No, he said simply. I expect understanding. A ripple of movement flickered through the Dominion officers lining the room, and Vaiken saw it, the shift, the way shoulders eased just slightly, the way gazes darted between one another, looking for a leader that was no longer present. The vehemence wasn't just Hale's prize. It was a test, a final confirmation of whether this fleet would break or bend. Vaiken had one move left, and it wasn't war. He took a breath, slow and deliberate. You expect me to endorse this? Hale studied him. I expect you to lead it. The final step in the dismantling of an empire, not its destruction, not its forced compliance, its transformation. Hale wasn't here to demand surrender. He was here to offer continuity. The room held its breath. The weight of choice settled on Vaiken's shoulders, heavier than any battle he had ever fought. He could refuse. He could let the Dominion die here, in the cold silence of a battle that had never truly been fought. Or he could guide it into something new. The final war was not about weapons. It was about the future that would follow. Vaiken closed his eyes briefly. Then he exhaled and spoke. The war ended that day, not in fire, but in a single decision. The weight of Vaiken's decision settled on the room like a falling blade, invisible but absolute. No one spoke. The Dominion officers barely moved, their eyes shifting between their commander and the human envoy who had orchestrated the moment. Desmond Hale did not celebrate. He did not gloat. He simply observed. Always observing. You made the right choice, Commander, Hale said at last, his voice carrying no triumph, only certainty. Vaiken exhaled slowly, releasing a breath that felt heavier than his own body. There had been no other choice, not truly. The Dominion had already been severed from within. His refusal would have accomplished nothing except prolonging the inevitable. But acceptance was not surrender. His eyes locked onto Hale's. "Tell me the next step." The human's expression did not change, but there was something in the way his fingers twitched at his side, a flicker of movement that betrayed calculation. Even now, even with the Dominion gutted, they still played their game. "The transition will be seamless," Hale said smoothly, stepping toward the laser plasma display that now pulsed with a network of blue-lit sectors, territories absorbed into the human alliance. Economic stabilization protocols are already in motion. Resource redistribution will commence immediately. Your fleets will be integrated within the next cycle. Vaiken barely heard him. His attention had fixed on the map, a shift in the patterns, not within Dominion space, but beyond it. "You're already moving past us," he murmured, eyes narrowing. Hale's pause was slight but noticeable, a fraction of hesitation quickly buried beneath his usual composure. "Expansion is a natural progression," the human said. "A species does not thrive by standing still." Vaiken's throat tightened. He glanced at Audrin, who had also noticed the shift. This had never been about the Dominion. This had been a blueprint, a test case. And now, it was finished. His fingers hovered over the display controls, adjusting the map, expanding it. The blue zones did not stop at Dominion borders. They were already creeping outward, tendrils reaching for other unaligned sectors, frontiers that should have been untouchable. "You've already ceded them," Vaiken muttered. Hale did not deny it. Trade agreements, resource dependencies, political sponsorships. The human's voice remained level, but his posture had shifted. Weight distributed, a man preparing for the next move in a game only he could see in full. Vaiken's pulse thrummed in his throat. The Dominion had been dismantled without war. The next empire would fall the same way, and the next, and the next. He had not ended a war. He had witnessed the first successful conquest of a civilization without a single shot fired, and it would not be the last. He could guide it into something new. The final war was not about weapons. It was about the future that would follow. Vaiken closed his eyes briefly. Then he exhaled and spoke. The war ended that day, not in fire, but in a single decision. The weight of Vaiken's decision settled on the room like a falling blade, invisible but absolute. No one spoke. The Dominion officers barely moved, their eyes shifting between their commander and the human envoy who had orchestrated the moment. Desmond Hale did not celebrate. He did not gloat. He simply observed. Always observing. "You made the right choice, Commander," Hale said at last, his voice carrying no triumph, only certainty. Vaiken exhaled slowly, releasing a breath that felt heavier than his own body. There had been no other choice, not truly. The Dominion had already been severed from within. His refusal would have accomplished nothing except prolonging the inevitable. But acceptance was not surrender. His eyes locked onto Hale's. "Tell me the next step." The human's expression did not change, but there was something in the way his fingers twitched at his side, a flicker of movement that betrayed calculation. Even now, even with the Dominion gutted, they still played their game. "The transition will be seamless," Hale said smoothly, stepping toward the laser plasma display that now pulsed with a network of blue-lit sectors, territories absorbed into the human alliance. Economic stabilization protocols are already in motion. Resource redistribution will commence immediately. Your fleets will be integrated within the next cycle. Vaiken barely heard him. His attention had fixed on the map, a shift in the patterns, not within Dominion space, but beyond it. "You're already moving past us," he murmured, eyes narrowing. Hale's pause was slight but noticeable, a fraction of hesitation quickly buried beneath his usual composure. "Expansion is a natural progression," the human said. "A species does not thrive by standing still." Vaiken's throat tightened. He glanced at Audrin, who had also noticed the shift. This had never been about the Dominion. This had been a blueprint, a test case. And now, it was finished. His fingers hovered over the display controls, adjusting the map, expanding it. The blue zones did not stop at Dominion borders. They were already creeping outward, tendrils reaching for other unaligned sectors, frontiers that should have been untouchable. "You've already ceded them," Vaiken muttered. Hale did not deny it. Trade agreements, resource dependencies, political sponsorships. The human's voice remained level, but his posture had shifted. Weight distributed, a man preparing for the next move in a game only he could see in full. Vaiken's pulse thrummed in his throat. The Dominion had been dismantled without war. The next empire would fall the same way, and the next, and the next. He had not ended a war. He had witnessed the first successful conquest of a civilization without a single shot fired, and it would not be the last. Audrin took a step forward, eyes burning with a question he already knew the answer to. "This doesn't stop with us, does it?" Hale turned his head slightly, just enough for his gaze to meet Audrin's without breaking the rhythm of his movements. "It was never meant to." The lieutenant's jaw clenched. Vaiken's breath was steady, but his hands curled into fists. He had thought he had chosen survival. He had thought he had secured his people's future. But all he had done was delay their fate. Hale studied him for a long moment, reading everything that passed across his expression. "You look troubled, Commander," the envoy said, tilting his head slightly. "Did you think we only played this game once?" The words settled like frost in his lungs. And then the doors slid open. Two figures entered. Cathari. Not officers, not Dominion personnel, officials from the Civilian Council. Vaiken inhaled sharply. They had never been told about this meeting. They had been brought here, by them. Hale turned to greet them, voice slipping into something warm, welcoming. "Ah, you're just in time." Vaiken's stomach twisted. This was not an occupation. This was a coronation. Not of warlords, but of diplomats. The humans had not just dismantled the Dominion's military. They had ensured that when the dust settled, the leaders who remained were the ones who had already been prepared to embrace their rule. The war had not ended. It had simply changed form. One of the council members, Edris Vale, a woman known for her support of off-world trade relations, smiled politely as she extended her hand to Hale. "It's a pleasure," she said smoothly. "We have much to discuss regarding the transition." Vaiken's muscles locked, a storm roaring beneath his skin. Audrin's breath came slow, controlled, but his eyes burned with something unspoken. They had just witnessed the end of the Dominion, and no one else even realized it had happened. Hale nodded, clasping Edris's hand in his own. "Of course," he said, voice effortlessly composed. "Shall we begin?" The doors sealed behind them. The new war had already started. Vaiken Dhoris stood motionless, his back rigid as the doors sealed behind Hale and the council members. The weight in his chest was not unfamiliar. He had felt it before, on battlefields where the dead lay in unmarked graves, where the victory had been carved out of ruin. But this time, there was no battlefield, no bodies, only conversations behind closed doors, contracts signed with poised smiles, and a war that had been lost before the first shot was ever considered. He turned sharply, locking eyes with Audrin, who had already shifted closer, waiting for an unspoken command. The lieutenant's posture was tense, his shoulders squared in defiance, but there was something beneath it. Not fear, understanding. Audrin had seen the shift, the way the Dominion's fate had been rewritten, not with force, but with a handshake. Vaiken exhaled slowly, his voice low. "We have one shot left." Audrin didn't ask what he meant. He didn't need to. Instead, his jaw tightened, and his hand hovered near his console, waiting. "Tell me where." Vaiken moved toward the laser plasma display, his fingers gliding over the interface. The Dominion's occupied sectors flickered in a mosaic of blue, human-controlled space expanding like a slow-moving storm. But he wasn't looking at what had been taken. He was looking at what was left. "We won't get the fleet back," Vaiken said, eyes scanning the map. "We won't retake the shipyards, and we won't convince the Dominion to fight for something it no longer believes exists." Audrin's brows furrowed. Then what are we fighting for? Vaiken tapped the screen, enlarging a sector near the far edge of the Dominion's former territory, a system untouched by human acquisition, a place they hadn't yet turned their gaze toward. They haven't taken everything, he said. Not yet. Odrin frowned, studying the system. Halos Rift? It's barely habitable. That's why they haven't moved on it, Vaiken murmured. It doesn't hold value to them, but it holds something else. Odrin's eyes flicked to him, realization dawning. A point they haven't accounted for. Vaiken nodded once. Their greatest strength is control, stability. They don't initiate wars. They prevent them. They don't conquer planets. They absorb them. His voice was steady, measured. But they aren't invincible. They have weaknesses, just like any empire before them. Odrin exhaled sharply, watching him. And you know what it is. Vaiken's fingers tightened against the display. They rely on certainty. A slow beat passed. Odrin's expression sharpened, the weight of understanding settling over his shoulders. They plan decades in advance, Vaiken continued, voice edged with something dangerous. They predict every move before it happens, and they adjust accordingly. They win because they have no unknown variables. Odrin's pulse quickened, so we give them one. Vaiken's lips curled, not into a smile, but something colder. We give them chaos. The plan unfolded in his mind like a battle map. Not with fleets, not with invasions, with an absence of logic. Hale and his kind thrived on diplomacy, manipulation, and a predictable series of reactions. Every war they had ever fought was crafted in boardrooms, written into policies before the first day of engagement. So what happened when the war no longer made sense? Vaiken straightened, his voice quiet but firm. We fracture the pattern. Odrin's eyes flickered with something close to anticipation. How? Vaiken studied the display one last time. Then he turned, issuing his orders without hesitation. We go dark, he said. No transmissions, no fleet coordination. We cut ourselves off from every established network they've already infiltrated. Odrin nodded sharply. And Halos Rift? We disappear into it. A long pause stretched between them. The weight of the choice settled, not just on their shoulders, but on the future of what remained. This wasn't about reclaiming the Dominion. That was gone. But there were still places untouched, still people who had seen what had happened here and knew, even if they wouldn't say it aloud, that this was only the beginning. Vaiken exhaled, the remnants of a war-torn commander stepping into something new. We make them uncertain, he said. We take the one thing they have never accounted for, a fight that doesn't follow their rules. Odrin's hands moved over the controls, rerouting their course manually. Every digital log that could be traced, purged. Every navigation sequence, scrambled. There would be no records, no transmissions, only ghosts in the dark. Vaiken turned toward the viewport, watching the human-controlled sectors expand with each passing moment. He had spent his entire life fighting wars he could see. Wars fought with firepower and strategy, with ships that clashed in burning streaks of destruction. But this would be a war they would never see coming. He exhaled slowly, then gave the final command. Take us off the map. The ship vanished into the abyss. The ship moved through the void, unseen and silent. Halos Rift lay ahead, a graveyard of forgotten battles, a wasteland untouched by human hands. Vaiken Dhoris stood in the command deck, arms folded, watching the whirling debris fields, the lifeless moons caught in the slow, gravitational dance of a dying star. No beacons marked these coordinates. No patrols swept through the sector. To the Dominion, it had always been a dead end. To the humans, it wasn't even on the map. The weight of their plan pressed against his ribs. They were out of time, out of second chances. Odrin stood beside him, gaze locked onto the heads-up display, scanning the distortions in local space. No signs of pursuit. Yet. They won't ignore us forever, Odrin murmured. Once they realize we're still moving, they'll come. Vaiken's voice was calm, but steel-threaded. That's what we want. Audrin exhaled sharply, glancing at him. You ever think maybe we should have let the Dominion fall? Completely, I mean. Let it sink into history and be done with it? Vaiken's fingers curled against his arm. Empires fall, he said. Civilizations break. But the moment you stop fighting, you stop existing. The humans understand that. Audrin scoffed. They don't fight, not like we do. A slow, knowing smirk tugged at Vaiken's lips. No, he admitted. They fight better. Audrin's jaw tightened. You don't really admire them. Vaiken turned fully, eyes narrowing. You think admiration is the same as understanding? I understand them. That's what makes them dangerous. His voice dipped lower, carrying the weight of too many hard-earned truths. They never needed to be stronger. They just needed to be inevitable. Audrin didn't argue, because he knew. Every world, every government, every fleet they had subsumed, none had fallen through invasion. They had fallen through inevitability. The Dominion had tried to fight a war with weapons. The humans had fought it with certainty, and won. But certainty was a weapon that could be turned against them. Vaiken flicked his gaze back to the heads-up display, scanning the data feeds streaming from their hidden relays across the sector. Information stolen before they had vanished. Information the humans never intended them to have. He tapped a sequence into the console. The screen shifted, recalibrated, and then, there it was, a network, not military, not governmental, trade. The lifeline of their empire, the arteries through which their control spread. Not warships, not armies, but resource lanes, supply chains, infrastructure that ensured every species they touched became dependent on their influence. A structure built not on dominance, but on trust. The humans had no gods, no central ruler, no doctrine to unite them, only a belief in stability. And they had built that stability too well. Vaiken exhaled. We're going to break them. Audrin straightened. We don't have the firepower for that. We don't need firepower, Vaiken murmured, tapping a new command. The screen shifted again. A calculated series of system-wide disruptions mapped out like a strategist's last, desperate hand in a losing game. Except this wasn't desperation. This was understanding. He turned, meeting Audrin's gaze. They aren't afraid of war, he said. They're afraid of chaos. Audrin's lips parted slightly. Realization sank in. Everything they've built, it only works because people believe it will. Vaiken nodded. And the moment they don't, it collapses. Not a war. Not a conflict of equals. A controlled demolition. The humans had spent decades weaving the perfect net, but nets were only as strong as the belief that they could not be broken. Audrin's expression darkened with something dangerous. So what do we hit first? Vaiken's fingers flew across the console. The data feeds shifted. Names of stations, transport hubs, critical nodes in the human network, but not military targets, civilian, logistics. They weren't going to fight the Empire. They were going to make everyone else question it. Vaiken's voice was steady, final. We cut the lines they've spent decades building. We turn allies into doubters, doubters into enemies. We scatter the pieces so wide they can't put them back together fast enough. We show them what happens when certainty dies. Audrin exhaled sharply. You think it's enough? Vaiken's gaze didn't waver. I think it's never been done to them before. A flicker of something reckless and unyielding burned in Audrin's eyes. We're going to turn their own game against them. A slow smile touched Vaiken's lips. It's the only kind of war they don't know how to fight. The plan was set. Halos Rift would be their staging ground, not a last stand, but a first strike. And when the first lines broke, when the first whispers of doubt spread through human space, when colonies and leaders and entire nations began to wonder, the humans would do what they always did. They would smile. They would offer stability. They would insist, so very politely, that there was nothing to fear. And that would be the moment they lost. Because by then, everyone would know the truth. If the humans were smiling, it was already too late to run.